a few objectives that I have that I'd like to accomplish today in the time that we have together. The first is really just to talk about searching for a job and some of the steps necessary to pursue job opportunities. The second is to present a sort of template for how one goes about looking for a job, and eventually that will culminate in the bulk of our conversation today, which will be the employment interview. So there's kind of a before, during, and after related to the job interview, but I think that sometimes there's a lot of emphasis placed on the during, but not necessarily as much on the before and after. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to be focusing right now in the next few minutes on the before, as mentioned, that part of looking for a job, pre-interview is going to be predicated on a few different assumptions. Number one, this assumes that one has a certain emotional and pragmatic trajectory in mind to get a certain job situation that will be aligned with one's professional goals. The second is that one is looking for a job that will be a fit. Sometimes when interviews take place, interviewers are seeking someone who has this organizational fit. They'll be a fit for our team. They'll be a fit for the job, and so forth. So that alignment needs to be in both directions. You have to be prepared. And as I mentioned last time, when we dealt with the other topic last week, there invariably will be certain lifestyle and practical adjustments that people will need to make. And having that in mind ahead of time, being available and making room for those adjustments are really part of what we're talking about. Okay, there's a question that some people will talk about as an interview question, and I don't really like that as an interview question. And that is something like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Now, that is not I think while not an interview question per se, not a good interview question per se, to ask a candidate, I do feel that it is a question that we all should ask ourselves, because I use the word trajectory, having a path, having some short-term and long-term professional goals is quite important. And let's say if you're at a certain point on April the 13th, 2020, let's say you're in the process of graduating, you want to leverage your degree, maybe you have graduated a while ago. Wherever you are in life, wherever you are in your career, one should be forward thinking and say to themselves, where do I want to be in 4 or 5 years? What would that job title look like? Do I want to be a senior HR manager? Do I want to be a director of HR? If I'm further in my career, do I want to be a vice president of HR? Where do I really want to, where do I really want to be in 5 years? And then the challenge, of course, is how to get to that point. You are at point A right now, and you need to get to that point B, and one needs to plot out a path in doing that. I also, when I counsel students and advise students in their careers, I recommend that they develop some sort of mentor relationship. Now, at our university, in our program, we have mentoring that's done by advisory board members, but it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody that's connected to an academic institution. I've been a mentor, I guess, to some. It can be somebody who has, quote unquote, been there, done that, somebody who you look up to, somebody who has accomplished, somebody who has been to a place in their career that you very much would like to get to. And that is really a target that one can have for themselves. And a mentor can weigh in on one's plan to pursue a certain job, a certain career path, maybe a little bit of a diversion if necessary. I very much recommend that everybody come up with a mentor. Mentor is obviously not going to get paid, it's going to be pro bono, and develop that relationship so that that individual can be a sounding board for you. And we all have different preferences of types of organizations that we like to work for. Some people might be inspired to work for a nonprofit, or some might like the environment of a startup organization. Some might want to look for a more stable, larger organization. And also pragmatically, one needs to look at where they want to be financially, with a vertical path along one's career that hopefully should come with incremental growth in income. Okay, so I feel that one should look for jobs and explore opportunities really with this lens in mind. So once again, all I'm talking about right now is I think something that frames one's job search, and that will determine something we talked about last time, job titles that one seeks out, that one looks up on LinkedIn and tries to pursue different jobs. That's not going to be the topic of today, but suffice it to say, that is something that people should keep in mind. Maggie, next slide, please. Okay, there's an adage out there that is known as, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. And I'm sure many of you have heard of that adage. And it's important because when we present ourselves, and this really applies in any channel that we present ourselves, whether it's in person, certainly, but also as we present ourselves digitally, over the phone, in any format that we present ourselves, the very first impression that one makes is going to be a lasting one on the, let's say, interviewer in our scenario. And even prior to the interview, prior to you actually walking into a room or a Zoom room or a WebEx session, the persona that you are putting out there is going to come across through your communication, whether it's your written work, whether it's electronic communication, emails, and so forth. That is all going to convey a certain impression about you that will be received by the other person. Okay, the other party, I should say.
All right. So another thing that people should really be cognizant of is their presence on LinkedIn search on your profile. It will be maybe even Facebook, other social media platforms that exist. And I think it goes without saying that one should be very careful about the persona that they have online. And when we think about LinkedIn, I have a certain bias. I'm a very big LinkedIn user. Today is really not the time to talk about building your LinkedIn profile. That really is a larger discussion. But it's important, number one, to have a LinkedIn profile. Number two, to have an updated LinkedIn profile. And number three, to have a serious LinkedIn profile, meaning no spelling errors, make sure it's up to date, and have some reasonable content, and to start to make certain professional connections that might come in handy for you. Because, like it or not, that is public information that people will be taking a look at. So that is another first impression that one might be conveying. Next slide, please. Elevator speech is a term that has been used in different contexts, perhaps most often in networking, being proactive in networking, or being able to introduce yourself professionally, because that's really what the elevator pitch is. It is a kind of self-contained business card that one is conveying in person when you meet with someone. And you want to also make a positive first impression, because that positive first impression might in fact lead to a phone screen or an interview later on. So when you meet with that person, or even prior to meeting with that person, one should have a very well-developed elevator speech. So when one is meeting, just kind of follow it through, when one is meeting someone at a conference, whether it's PSYOP or whether it's CHRA or PTC, this should be part of the person's mental planning. And it should be about a half a minute to 45 seconds, no more than that. And the very first should be, and I kind of say this with a little bit of a chuckle, handshake and eye contact, but that would be violating the 6 feet rule of social distancing. So I would just kind of put that out there, as hopefully when things get back to normal, that would be appropriate. And then have not only your name, but also who are you? What do you identify with? Are you an HR professional? Are you an IO psychology professional? Are you a talent management professional? So that should be, you should have a tagline similar to what you would expect to see on a business card. So if you're looking for a job, on your business card, you wouldn't necessarily have the name of an employer, but you would have a tagline that really identifies who you are professionally. You might want to say, I recently graduated with my master's in IO from UMBC, or if you have any sort of certifications from SHRM, and then maybe touch upon a couple of expertise areas. So for example, if data science is your thing, you might want to throw that in. If talent acquisition is your thing, or organizational development is your thing, you should be using industry appropriate labels to identify yourself when you are making that introduction. Whether it's in an interview or an elevator speech, which is the purpose of this slide, one thing I would say is to try to limit what I refer to as common cliches. Common cliches would be, for example, I'm a multitasker, I'm a problem solver. Those are, I have excellent communication skills. Those are things that are not necessarily objective. Those are subjective labels about yourself, because they can really mean different things to different people. But if you say that I have 2 years of experience in talent acquisition, managing an HRIS system, so that says something about you that's quite specific and objective. You may also want to include, if you're networking for job search purposes, what you're looking for. Maybe that person whom you meet is someone that knows of someone else that is looking, or could be looking in the future for a position that would match what your professional goals are. And then, of course, after your elevator speech is finished, be prepared to kind of dive into the weeds as appropriate based on the questions that that person asks of you. Oh, you have 2 years of experience in talent acquisition. In what space was that? Was that in healthcare? Was that in financial services? So you should be prepared to further utilize sophisticated, mature buzzwords to identify and to explain what you've done for your organization. In terms of the personal emotional balance here, it really is a balance between confidence and humility. Humility, of course, is humbleness, where you don't want to take credit for things that you did not do or don't know much about, but also at the same time, you should be exuding a certain sense of confidence of knowing, certain things that you have been trained or have been experienced in. This slide has what I refer to as IO lingo, and these are some buzzwords that are either functional or job titles. As you can see in the second column, you have job titles that are acronyms: CHRO, Chief Human Resource Officer; CTO, Chief Talent Officer, although in some contexts that would be Chief Technology Officer; CPO, which is Chief People Officer. But be familiar with some of these terms. So, for example, if you have experience having worked for a DoD agency, so that would be an agency. But if you might have worked as a contractor, let's say for Booz Allen, that is supporting a DoD agency. So that's another, as you can see on the column number 2, you can see some, you can see that represented. RFP refers to request for proposal. In the consulting world, you may have worked on an RFP, but these are what I would refer to as industry standard buzzwords: analytics, big data, metrics, and so forth. These are either functional areas that you should be including in your elevator speech or in your interview as you're responding to questions, and you should be proficient in using these words. I'm a psychologist limited because in Maryland, at least the state of Maryland, which is where we're broadcasting from, the term IO psychologist is limited to people with licenses, with licensure, with psychology licensure by the state entity, by the Maryland Board of Psychologists. And if you're an IO psychologist with licensure, then one would not be allowed to call themselves any type of psychologist. You could say IO psychology professional, perhaps, but just keep that in mind. Unless you are licensed, you should be identifying yourself as an IO psychologist, with the exception of certain government agencies where they do allow personnel psychologists or IO psychologists to be used. Next slide, please. Once again, in preparation for applying for jobs, and we're going to be spending more time on a different seminar, this different webinar, on how to develop resumes and cover letters. But I'm just going to suffice it to say that one should have a copy of their updated resume on hand that's good to go. That could be submitted in response to a job ad, because sometimes they are planning on interviewing very, very soon, and you want to make sure that you have it no matter where you are. Now, many people are at home, so they will have that, but in ordinary times, one should make sure to have those materials at the ready. And I have here version control. That's just a point of emphasis, that for people that have different copies of different versions of their resume, make sure you're sending the right version to the right employer. Especially when it comes to cover letters, you want to make sure that there's no language in the cover letter, or if you're sending an email, you want to make sure that there's no language that is reflective of the previous job that you applied for, because that's definitely a faux pas. As part of the preparation that one does is, as I have on this slide, legwork. It's important to really be proficient in what the organization does. You know, on a very basic level, what kind of company is it? Is it a for-profit company? Is it a nonprofit organization? Is it government? Is it public sector, private sector? That's a basic point of preparation. And then one should be able to encapsulate and have a good working memory of certain distinguishing skills, experiences that you've had that would allow you to convey those during an interview. Once again, we haven't even gotten up to the point where you're actually sitting in the room, because it goes without saying, preparation is really going to be key here, because in order to pull those things out during an interview in a seamless, flawless way, you have to have these rolling off your tongue. So if, for example, you're quantitatively oriented, so that might be something that you want to make sure that you convey to the employer. If you have a background in training, then that is an experience in training, then that's something that you want to be able to convey. And if you have a background in running statistics or developing tests or assessment centers, let's say you've had some experience. Some of our students will go down to Alabama and get some experience. So that's something that you want to make sure you have not only on your resume, but you want to make sure that that is a point of emphasis as you're responding to certain questions. And then the last is what we call clearinghouse questions, which means those are going to be the questions that you will ask of an interviewer at the end of the interview. It's going to show that you're thoughtful about the job, about the situation. So make sure that you have a couple of these questions in your back pocket, because ultimately you will be asked, now that we've asked a lot of questions of you, what questions do you have of us? And it shouldn't be very pragmatic questions. They should be thoughtful questions. It shouldn't be how much salary is going to be associated with this job. That's generally not good form to ask that during the interview. That's something you get from other means. You should have some thoughtful questions planned from the beginning. These are some very practical suggestions. You want to make sure that you have a good night of sleep the night before. And this, by the way, applies equally to WebEx or other virtual interviews. It's going to come across that you are tired. You look a little, you look a little disheveled. If you 5 minutes before you have the interview, you roll out of bed. You want to make sure that you are well rested and well groomed, as we'll see, and that will make you look good. In normal situations, I would recommend setting your calendar, your travel calendar, to be in the reception area or wherever you're going to first check in. You should plan on being there about 15 minutes before your scheduled start time. And that will give you an opportunity to use the restroom, to freshen up a little bit, also to kind of get mentally in tune with what you're about to be doing, which is putting your best foot forward and making a positive impression. And sometimes you might need to review some notes that you have about yourself, those 3 to 5 selling points, some notes about the organization, but we'll talk about a tool that might be appropriate as well for that. Now, what to bring to the interview. And even though we're living, and once again, this would be if you're engaged in an in-person interview, even though a lot of things are digital today, but there might be some room to at least have on hand, not to necessarily proactively give them, but if, let's say, there was a change in your resume that occurred between the time that you applied for the job, maybe there was a time lag, and the date of the interview, you want to make sure that the interviewer has the most up-to-date version of your resume. And if you sense that they may not, that way you'll have it on hand to be able to share. There might be some work samples to share if relevant. I'm not a big fan of throwing paper at the interviewer, but if you feel that there's a need to share that at that time, you'll at least have it with you. Sometimes just be walking out with the hard copies, but at least you'll have them at the ready. Have some writing space on which you can take notes during the interview questions. And Maggie, I'm going to go through the last points on this slide, but I'm going to ask you if you can, there's a second file. I might ask you to share that right after we do this slide called the Smart Sheet. So, of course, you need to know how to get there, driving directions. You may want to have a backup in case your Waze or Google Maps is not working. If it's a very important interview, you want to make sure you have a backup. If there's something catastrophic that happens, have the phone number of the contact person already in your calendar or somewhere on your phone. Of course, you want to bring a charged cell phone. And if you already have some pre-selected professional references, you might want to have a printout of that as well, because if the interview goes well, you might want to share that information with them, because at the very end of the interview, they say, we're thinking of moving fast on this. Can you provide us with some references when you get back home? And you could say, oh, as a matter of fact, I have it right here. So it really just shows that you're prepared, even even if they don't, if they ask for it, certainly it shows that you're prepared even though you might have a way of getting it to them electronically an hour later. I created this in Word, and I call this a smart sheet. And from the very top, if you take a look at what you could be putting in ahead of time, there might be certain facts and figures about the organization that you can research that you feel might inform some answers to your questions that might be very difficult to memorize. And some people have different memory than others, but I would suggest maybe putting some things about, take it from the website or take it from the financial report of the organization that you get. There might be some things about the organization, some names, the CEO, and having it here could allow you to drop those names or facts and figures during the interview. So that's something that you would pre-populate and print out. I would recommend doing it on a piece of paper rather than on an iPad. I would recommend a hard copy of this. So that top portion would be customized to the organization and to the job. And below that, as the interview is getting started, let's just assume there is a panel interview and there are 3 people. So what you might want to do is, as people are introducing themselves, hopefully they will introduce themselves and their job title, you might want to jot down what their name is around this table that you see. This really is just kind of a square, rectangle that is. And that way you might be able to use their name. Mr. Jones, that was a very good question. So having that information would allow you to use names, but it also might give you a sense of, let's say, who is the prime decision maker. Let's say if there's somebody that appears to be the most senior in the group, so that person is the vice president of HR, so you might want to just put that down. And we're going to come to the to the questions in a moment, but the next portion of that smart sheet, just going down a little bit to that table, parts of questions and possible response points, that's for, as the questions are being asked, in the first column, let's say for question 1, you would kind of jot down the parts of the question, and then think about, let's say for a, what we call behavior, let's say they ask, can you tell me about a time when you had to deal with conflict? So as the question is being read, you might want to just jot down key points. Okay, this was the situation before that I encountered. This is what I did, that's the during, and then what the outcome was. Now, of course, you're really just putting down a word or two that would just be code for how you might formulate your response. And that would be an effective response, because when you're responding to a behavioral question, you want to present a context, and having that before, during, after is a powerful way of responding to that question. The next section, the 3 to 5 work-related competencies that you would want the employer to know about you, that also would be pre-populated. Okay, so the very top would be pre-populated, and here would be they'd be pre-populated as well. And then you might want to come up with what we call the clearinghouse questions you might have for them. Sometimes people struggle with memorizing these questions. So these are, I wouldn't recommend asking all of these, but maybe, let's say, 1 or 2 of these questions would be appropriate. Okay, so this is what I refer to as an interview smart sheet. I would try to keep it on 1 page, using a font that you can read. You may need to go a little small, but hopefully it's something that you can read. And this would be something that if I were an interviewer, I would say, wow, that's really prepared and is not falling by the seat of their pants. And having this document in front of you and allowing you to take notes as the questions are being asked and planning your responses out, I think would have some great value. All right, thank you, Maggie. Let's go back to the slides where we were. This is what I call the smart sheet. This can be made available to you. We will get this out the same way we got out the materials last time. So those are the kind of practical things to bring with you in your folder, in your briefcase. But what else does one bring to an interview? Well, I think positivity, we talked about confidence balanced with humility. But I would say being positive about the organization, but not over the top, not being overly effusive, because that can come across as artificial. Nobody gets that excited about a job, but at least have a positive attitude about the organization, not just knowing about the organization, having done research, but coming up with a positive affect about it, about the job, about the work activities. And also, we're going to talk about in the next slide what not to bring. Should be professionally appropriate. Now, I'm going to make a joke here because this is what everybody's saying. This might be from the waist up. What one is wearing below the camera, might be a different story. But let's just assume we're talking about in regular times where one is dressed in what we call a business dress, a certain side of formality. There was a situation where I actually interviewed for an interim HR position several years ago. It was, just a short consulting stint, and they told me not to wear a suit. It was a factory, so nobody wore a suit in the factory. But for the most part, it's always best to err on the side of what we call formality or business dress. And the grooming should be appropriate. Any sort of things that are out of the ordinary, you should kind of either mute or subdue or cover. But before you leave the house in the morning, your apartment, wherever you're coming from, or upstairs, as the case might be, remember to use a mirror and check yourself out, maybe having somebody else check you out. I know it's a little difficult now because grooming places like hair salons are now closed, but you might get a pass in 2020. But beyond that, I would recommend following these suggestions. And I'm not going to read it verbatim. I'm sure for the most part, this resonates with you, especially those who have been in the business world already. These are just some general guidelines for business attire, and that would be, appropriate. It's important to envision the types of questions that might be asked, and that I have kind of them categorized. First, there might be some opening questions, such as the example that we have here. Why are you interested in a certain job with our company? And you should have a reasonable response, maybe based on research that you've already done. Then we have behavioral questions and situational questions. For those of you who have been in my methods of assessment class, you probably know about that distinction, but I think we'll have some examples coming up in the coming slides. But those are questions that either ask about your past performance, or in the case of the situational question, it'll be more about how you would handle a specific situation in the present tense. And then you might get questions that will tap into your technical or job knowledge. That would be akin to maybe a test question, so to speak. Next slide, please. Other possible questions you should be prepared to respond to, maybe questions that are not entirely obvious based on your resume, about your education and training, maybe about your skills. For the most part, you should have a lot of these things on your resume, but be prepared for some follow-up questions that might get deeper into the specifics for any of these components. At the very end, the slide, the bottom of the slide, you see about your availability. That might be a question towards the end of the interview, as well as your salary expectations. And that is something that could take place in a phone screen, or it could take place in an in-person interview. It's a tricky question. We talked about responding to that question and how to do that last week, that I'm not going to get into right now. Next slide, please. These are behaviors. Once you walk into the room, obviously, if we're doing a virtual interview, there's no physical handshake, but the eye contact. Just keep in mind that when you're looking at a website, I am right now, and you can see me in my home office, a webcam has the screen that has the picture, but it also has the camera that's directed at you. And it's always a good idea to be looking straight at the camera rather than at the screen, if at all possible. Now, if you're taking notes, then you're, if I'm kind of taking notes now, then I'm kind of looking down. That's understandable, and that might be appropriate for responding to a question as you're taking notes. And I think that one advantage actually of a WebEx or Zoom interview is that you can have various resources, maybe even more information on a cheat sheet, maybe multiple pieces of paper that they can't necessarily see that you have on the side of you. So that might actually be something that you can use to your advantage. But just be aware that the eye contact is going to be with that camera. So right now I'm looking directly into the camera. Right now I'm looking down. Right now I'm looking at the screen. Just be aware of the different views and the way that people will see you. Of course, when you are in a real interview, make sure that your posture is not slumped over or, you know, kind of too laid back, because that nonverbal communication will also resonate with the interviewer. And of course, the objective is to try to sell yourself, show that you will be a valued asset to the organization. And so that's why it's important to have that research to know what is important to them. And you know, part of your research could be finding people who work for the organization, but the people who have worked for the organization in the past. Of course, applies to an in-person interview, but I would certainly say it applies to a virtual interview as well. You shouldn't be texting. In fact, I turned off my phone completely so that my phone will not ring. My landline is still plugged in. Maybe I should unplug that, but just unplug that so that that phone will not ring. But certainly your attention, your undivided attention should be on the interview itself and the task at hand. During the interview, try to have quantities, let's say accomplishments. You have reduced costs by 30%, if you increase revenue by 20%, if you were able to secure a grant of $10,000, $20,000, those specifics, the same way we're going to talk about when we deal with writing a resume, that specific numbers will definitely resonate because those represent objective data about your accomplishments. Okay? You know, flexibility, showing that you can adapt. If I were looking for somebody that could do, you know, let's say both remote and in-person work, and I was looking for that in 2019, that might be something that is appealing to me as an employer. Oh, you have expertise in virtual technology. Well, that will help us in the future. Now it really helps in retrospect. But you know, present yourself as a flexible person. And this is a subtle kind of minor thing, but it really is important. And that is to use correct type name pronunciation. So there's nothing that's more grating when we hear somebody pronounce our name incorrectly, or let's say if you have someone who has a PhD degree that's part of the interview panel and you refer to them as Mr. instead of Doctor, you should make sure that you have all of those name pronunciations and titles straight, because that is going to, it's appropriate, it's proper, and if you don't do that, it might come across in a negative way. Next slide, please. Okay, during the interview, I talked about doing this first bullet point on the spreadsheet. Another important guideline is don't feel that you're on the clock. If you need to take a pause and maybe jot down some notes, now I'm not talking about jotting down some notes for 15 seconds or 30 seconds before you answer the question, but you know, if you have to jot down something that's going to take you 5 seconds or maybe 7 seconds, that's acceptable because it shows that you're engaged. It shows that you want to respond in a thoughtful way. So don't feel that you need to respond, you know, immediately. I mentioned when formulating the smart sheet and really when preparing yourself for the interview to come across to come up with 3 to 5 selling points about yourself, about your experience, about your competencies, in order to put them into your answers as appropriate, and answer questions in a definitively and professional sounding way using some of the buzzwords that we talked about at the very beginning, some of the slides, talent management, talent acquisition, needs analysis, using acronyms. Those are all appropriate to use and pull out during the interview. Next, please. One of the more popular modalities for interviews today, and I say today, not just 2020, but I would say the past 10 years even, been the use of panel interviews. There's a certain efficiency of doing it that way, where you would have panel members that rotate questions, but on your seating chart, that's why it's more important to take notes as to it. And even if it's just one person that's asking you the question at any given time, make sure that you kind of rotate your eye contact to address everybody non-verbally, even though you're really responding to a question from the person on your left, but make sure that you kind of give eye contact and credibility and validation to everybody. So that is something for a panel interview. Another point is, and we kind of all like being addressed by name. So let's say I see Marty's on the call now. Marty asked me a question. I would say, Marty or Ms. Langford, that's a very important question about my competencies. One thing I would say is X, Y, and Z. But putting it out there that I am recognizing that Marty or Ms. Langford is in the room, that I'm addressing her, that I think evokes a certain emotional connection. So that might be something not necessarily for every question, but maybe a couple times during the interview, address them by their first name or by Dr. Smith or Mr. Jones, whatever it may be, or their first name if that's what they prefer. That would be something that I would recommend. Next. We have the in-person interview, of course, which we've been alluding to, but there are also other modalities, Skype, WebEx, Zoom. But be aware that there might be an interview that is called, in common parlance, a phone screen, where it's done by somebody who is, let's say, an HR, somebody who's not the hiring manager, but the person wants to just get a sense of, where what your skills are in general, what your ballpark salary needs are, and that information will be conveyed to the hiring manager. So this is kind of like a pre-interview. But nonetheless, if it is an in-person interview with a recruiter, a third-party recruiter, let's say, that is something that you should also prepare for as you would any interview. There's a typo there, in person it should be. So you may also have an in-person interview at a job fair, or it could be a virtual job fair as well, which is probably more commonplace now. Next slide, please. Okay. So now we've discussed the beginning, the before rather, we've discussed the during. Now we're going to discuss the after, because the first impression that you make is going to, that impression management is going to continue all the way up until, let's say, the hiring decision. But after the interview, after you walk out of the room or after you leave the Zoom room, there's going to be a certain amount of follow-up that is going to be required, really, and suggested to you. So the first point is some sort of follow-up email. And my recommendation is not just something, oh, thank you very much for your time, I look forward to hearing from you. Yeah, that's nice, but I think that there might be some additional information to convey. There might be certain things that were that you noticed about the organization based on their description that are additionally appealing to you. There might be something that you can convey in a positive way after the interview that you did not know before the interview, that you can in your email, in your follow-up thank you note email. I wouldn't go on and on and on, but there might be a couple of specific points, some things you learned about the organization during the interview. Instead of just sending them a generic thank you note, you might want to include that. In addition, there might be an opportunity to correct, add on to something that you either forgot or you didn't get absolutely sharp, maybe some detail that you might want to add. You can tactfully do that in the follow-up email, because by that point they've not made a decision. In most cases, they've not made a decision about you, and just don't think that the test is totally over once you walk out of the room. There might be a way of kind of getting in a last word edgewise after the interview. There might be some follow-up materials such as references, we talked about that before, or other materials that might be requested of you, make sure that you do that you have access to those materials in order to do that. And also, since you're kind of engaged in that relationship, in the process of pursuing that job, you want to make sure that your channels of communication are being monitored. Your cell phone, you're checking your messages, you're checking your voicemails, you're checking your emails. You want to make sure that from that point on, not that you have to check them 15 times a day, but at least be able to respond, let's say, to a request for scheduling a second interview or for additional information. If you don't have good communication access, then that is not going to be taking place. Now, one question that I get somewhat often is, what happens if I haven't heard back from them? So I tend to use the 2-week rule. If you haven't heard back within 2 weeks of the interview, then I would, of course, you've already sent the thank you email. I would proactively say, as you know, let's say, Mr. Smith, as you know, we met in your office on April the 13th, at which time I had applied for the job as Director of HR. I just want to let you know I'm still interested in the position. And if you can give me an update as to what the timeline for your decision is, I would appreciate it. So once again, you've kind of put yourself out there, but you're not in their face and demanding an answer. You say, if you can give me a sense of what your timeline for the decision-making process is, that's a very soft way of really just reminding them that you still exist and that you're still interested in the job. But unfortunately, because of different situations and people on vacation and just general, unprofessional practice, just keep in mind that employers are not necessarily the greatest in the follow-up department, so you may just have to be additionally patient. Next slide, please. Okay, at this point, I'm just looking at the time also, so we're kind of at the 2:05 mark. We had a little bit of a technical glitch before. I want to invite anybody who has a question to unmute themselves, and you can ask any questions you might have this time.
Hey, Dr. Lasson. This is Saad from UMBC's program. I was gonna ask, so about the follow-up email, that doesn't have to be after the phone screen, right? That has to be more like after the in-person.
I don't think that there's any harm in doing it after the phone screen as well. I think because once again, that phone screen is done by that person, an intermediary, if they're a recruiter, or they're somebody who actually works for the organization, maybe in HR. Once again, it doesn't. All it has to be is professional and cordial. It doesn't have to be anything that's going to take you more than a few minutes. But there might be certain things that you want to reflect on that you want to just include in the email. So I would recommend even a phone screen to have such a follow-up.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Dr. Lasson, I have one question, and this is Martin. How are you doing? I have a question in regards to the cover-up letters. I've heard so many people say that the hiring managers don't even look at them. So what's the point? And I've heard some hiring managers tell me that they're very self-serving, so they don't even bother looking at them. So do you think it's necessary, in particular, for a federal government job?
Federal government, because I would say anything that has a prescribed process that might not leave room for a cover letter, then I would say I would agree with you that it is superfluous. But there are some situations where I don't think it can hurt, especially if it's well written. And once again, I would encourage you to listen in when we do the workshop on writing cover letters, because I think you'll see, in terms of the way that I envision a cover letter being written, I think it can be written in a powerful way, and hopefully by writing it in that fashion, it will maximize the probability of it getting read. So I would say definitely, I wouldn't say across the board that it is a requirement, but if you are going to do it, then it should be done properly.
Well, I want to say thank you, Dr.
You're
Lasson.
welcome.
It's been great. I haven't seen you in a while except for your emails, but it's been great.
All right.
And I plan to be at the next one as well.
Okay, great. So once again, we've been doing these on Mondays at 1 o'clock, and last week was the first. Today was the second. We have 2 more coming up, so please make sure to tune in. Next time, same channel, so to speak. And I look forward to discussing additional pragmatic topics with you that relate to employment during this job search season. I guess we're done.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Have a good day, everybody.